Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. With close to 40 interviews now under my belt for this podcast, each and every week it becomes evident that I have only just begun to scratch the surface of available Australian literary talent. New books and new authors are popping up everywhere, so much so that I could happily fill my TBR pile exclusively with Australian fiction for the next couple of years and still not run out of books or authors to discover. This prospect fills my heart with joy. And so this week it gives me immense pleasure to introduce yet another fabulously talented Aussie author who honed his craft writing plays and scripts for television, including some of our most famous TV exports like Neighbours and Home and Away. As a student, he studied novel writing under industry heavyweights Elizabeth Joly and Tim Winton. Now he combines his love of writing with his work as a lecturer in screenwriting, and in 2017 was the recipient of an Australian Federal Government University Teaching Award. He has achieved international acclaim with his first three novels, which include Den of Wolves, Nest of Vipers and The Secret Heiress. And his latest novel, The Heart of the Ritz, I feel sure is headed in the same direction. Welcome to Luke Devenish.
Thank you, Claudine. I am so honoured to be here.
Oh, thank you. That's really nice of you to say. Now, that was a rather long introduction, but in preparation for this interview, reading up on your background, your work and your training, it struck me anew how amazingly talented many Australian authors are, and the quality of stories being published just seems to be hitting all the right notes at the moment.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's gobsmacking how much talent is out there, and the staggering amount of books that appear every month, really, in bookshops is just incredible. But I find it so inspiring. I just think we've got such a rich literary culture in this country that encompasses such a broad range too, across all the genres and the full depth of whatever we might define literary fiction as. I just think it's fantastic. So rather than being frightened about the competition, I just feel inspired.
I feel exactly the same way. So I actually wanted to just congratulate you on what I thought was a beautifully written and evocative, witty novel about Nazi-occupied Paris during World War II.
Oh, you're so kind. I think we should get married.
Bit of a problem.
Yeah.
I am already married, but thank you for the offer.
The sentiment's there. Yeah.
Indeed. So I was wondering, Luke, if you could tell me a little bit more about your beautiful novel.
Oh, well, it's set in the Hotel Ritz in Paris during the Nazi occupation, so that's roughly between 1940 and 1944. It was in many ways Paris's lowest ebb, and this is a city that's had a lot of low ebbs over its long history. But it was when basically the French government just collapsed in the face of of Hitler's Germany and their onslaught against their country. The Germans rolled in without any much opposition at all and just took over the whole city. And they viewed Paris as their playground. They did not want to destroy it. They wanted to keep it very much as it was. But they also wanted to mould it into their version of a playground, shall we say. Mm-hmm. And their playground really centred on the Hotel Ritz. It was a reward for any Nazi officer that was sent there. And the competition among them to live in the Ritz was pretty fierce. They really wanted to be there. And it was really about the hotel's reputation. It was the pinnacle of luxury, but a very discreet and very special kind of luxury. And a service that was normally extended to the uber wealthy and also royalty, but also people that were sort of movie stars and bohemian celebrities, I guess, artists and poets and people of that ilk, actors. So the Germans duly rolled in 1940 and took over half of the hotel. And that half they stacked with some pretty ghastly henchmen from Hitler's regime. The other half of the hotel they left there for the long-term French guests to continue living in. So it ended up with this bizarre situation where French celebrities and bohemians and very famous people were living cheek by jowl with with Nazis. And this is where things get very grey and very interesting. Not all the Germans were horrendous people. Many of them were just people that just had been swept up. They didn't have a lot of choice in it. They were just part and parcel of the army. That's how things were. And for some of the French women who were living at the Hotel Ritz, they found themselves falling in love with these men. They were good looking, extremely good looking. They were very polite. They were very well dressed. They had a different way of behaving with women than the French men did. French men were known for, harassing them in the street, wolf whistling, calling them names, not being all that polite. German men were very different. So this book is about those grey areas, the women finding themselves caught up in these romances with men who were morally very dubious. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is the extraordinary resistance cell that cropped up in the hotel amongst many of the guests and a great many of the staff. It was a hotbed of espionage, and it was happening right under the noses of these really quite awful men who, just because they were so dazzled by the hotel, they were having such a good time, they were living such a decadent lifestyle in the hotel, they were blind to what was going on. They simply couldn't see it. And at the heart of this resistance cell were women, a particularly number of aristocratic women who could afford to live at the hotel, but also teenagers, young people. They were the real source of the whole French resistance movement. Full stop. Actually, was people who grew up, who came of age under the Nazi regime. So we're talking about 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and I just found this story, when I discovered it in non-fiction terms, and I was reading about it historically, I just found so much inspiration in this, and I really knew that this was a story I wanted to tell. So that's what the Heart of the Ritz is about. Centres on 4 women who come from quite a variety of circumstances, but they're bonded together both as friends and both in adversity, really, in trying to survive in what is an increasingly awful regime there in Paris.
It is a fascinating area that you've explored in this novel, and I absolutely devoured it. I'm always fascinated by historical fiction writers like you and the ability to immerse a reader in a time and place so obviously not your own. So I wanted to ask you if you could tell me what research you did in order to write this novel.
Well, my research is always about books. My way in is always through other books, really. And for this one, there was a couple of things that were banging around in my head. Not ideas for historical fiction so much, but just general concerns. Around about the end of 2016, when Donald Trump had been elected over in the US, and there was just this terrible feeling of democracy feeling suddenly under threat in a way that it hadn't felt in decades and decades, in the way that he was assaulting various institutions of democracy there in his country. And this was coinciding also with a number of similar things that were happening in Europe. Countries like Austria and Poland were suddenly looking really very shaky in terms of their government structures, again with governments that seemed to be doing things that were not about maintaining democracy at all. So these things were really worrying me, because I read a lot of current affairs, and they were just really sitting in my head. And this side by side was my genuine feeling of resentment against people who are very anti-young people. I know so many people who are in their early 20s, late teens and early 20s, because my day job is I teach at Melbourne Uni. And so I've got so many people in my life who are young. And I really feel a great deal of sympathy for them in terms of what they're up against. So those two things were in my head. And when I, just by sheer accident, stumbled upon a book that gave the history of the Paris Ritz, of the Ritz Hotel, and I just read it for pleasure. It was the sort of book that I'd always pick up if I found it. So I was reading it on a holiday there in Phillip Island, and I just suddenly saw that there was another time in history where the two things that were really concerning me had been at the top of other people's minds, and what's more, had been addressed, and it ultimately ended up with a happy ending. So Paris, under the occupation, democracy couldn't have been more at risk. It actually disappeared completely. There was no democracy for that period in Paris, and it was the young people who'd been completely ignored, completely overlooked, a government that had abandoned them. It was the young people that really saved the day. It was the young people that joined that resistance, that formed that resistance, that started in very small, tiny ways, initially as practical jokes in some ways, and then that grew to become something really powerful that ultimately climaxed in the liberation when the Allied armies rolled in. So I just thought, oh my God, here's a thing. Here's a way that I can address these two concerns for me that are about contemporary life and sort of shine a mirror on the past and use that mirror to actually find some inspiration to show that we have overcome these problems before and we will do so again.
I must say, I had absolutely no idea about the significance of the role of the Ritz Hotel in the French resistance movement. Have you ever been to the Ritz?
Yes, I have.
Well, I mean, it sounded like a silly question, I guess. The way that you talked about the Ritz, and you obviously, had a very clear idea of the outline, that the plan, which was obviously very central to the story as well, I found really rather fascinating. So tell me about your time there.
There were a number of challenges writing about the Ritz. Okay, so first off, it is a little different today than it was then, back in 1940. It's had several renovations since that time. So the plan that I was working with was the 1940 plan, which was a little different. But that's neither here nor there, because the Ritz is still the Ritz. When you go to Paris, it is the hotel. It is incredibly expensive. I believe rooms start at about €1,500 a night. That might give you an idea.
Yeah.
So I have not stayed there. I am sadly not that wealthy, Claudine.
Well, I haven't either, friend.
My experience extends to a drink. That's about the best of it. I've had a drink out the back there, which in the book I call it the Combon Bar, but it's actually now known as the Hemingway Bar. So that's out the back. It is a very cool place to have a drink. Drinks, of course, aren't cheap either.
I bet they're not.
But it is a wonderful experience visiting the hotel. It was under renovation in recent times. It was shut for about 2 years, and it's opened again, I think, in 2016. So it's well worth visiting. It's very friendly. The service is astonishing. It's wonderful. It's not like they're going to turn you away at the door, but it is initially a little intimidating when you turn up, because it's just these wonderful sort of liveried people at the door to greet you. They greet you in French, of course. When they realise you're a non-French speaker, they seamlessly talk in English. They're very used to foreigners come to their hotel, and they're also used to people being a bit starstruck by it. And being French, they want you to be starstruck. It's all part of the experience. They know everything about their hotel, about its reputation and its importance and its history. And you get such a strong sense of that as you walk into it. But no, look, unless this book goes gangbusters, I'm not expecting to stay there anytime soon. But I will go back for another drink next time I'm in Paris.
Divine. Love it. So what I found especially remarkable about your book was that each of your main characters were women. Each with a different voice, each with a unique backstory and even culture, not to mention the cast of other female characters in the novel. So I wanted to ask, how were you able to get into this headspace so expertly?
Thank you for feeling that I did. That's certainly something I aim to do. I really love writing about women. I find women's stories so inspiring. This is my fourth historical fiction novel, and all four of them have had women at their heart, exploring women's experiences at various periods in the past. I find, as a gay man, that I feel a very strong connection with anyone who has experienced marginalisation in their life, that experience of being put to the side, of being overlooked, of being not taken seriously, of simply not being seen as part of the main game. And because I find history so inspiring and there's so many stories to be found, whenever I tend to look at any past period in any particular place, I invariably find that it is the marginalised people for that period that I'm drawn to. And sadly, pretty much every time, it's women. It's women who were experiencing extreme marginalisation in the past. So I am really drawn to look at their experience, to explore it in story terms, but most particularly look at the experience of those who were able to triumph in the face of marginalisation. That, for me, is where the inspiration is. Women that just got on with it and exceeded and excelled despite a society that would be seen to have been aimed against them. And so that's why, for this particular story, when I read about these very unlikely women in a way, aristocratic women, fashion plates, women that were dismissed because of the way they looked, attractive, beautifully dressed women that the Germans just did not take seriously because all they could see was the surface. So more fool them, because these women were doing amazingly courageous things behind the scenes, so brave, and for some of them, it cost them their lives. You know, they died in the attempt to try and bring liberty back to the city they so loved. So I just felt there was just a natural place for me when I found that real story. When I found that there, I thought this is the sort of story that I like to tell. I love to explore people who got on with it and triumphed, but also, you know, to be honest with you, I do enjoy a glamour wash. I like, as much as a reader, I like to submerge myself in a world that is very enticing, you know, that is beautiful, it's very attractive, that has that, as I call it, a glamour wash over the top. There's a genre in historical fiction which is called behind the palace doors, and this is what all of my books have been, really. It gives the reader the glimpse behind doors that would otherwise be locked to them, where you can see how the other half live. But of course, what makes those stories so appealing ultimately is that you always discover that the other half are living lives that are no better than yours.
Yeah.
They might be better dressed, but usually their problems are far worse. So that's what the genre is all about, and the heart of the Ritz is certainly sitting inside it.
I was especially intrigued by your exploration of women who were seen to be collabos, you know, those who collaborated knowingly for protection and benefit, and then there were the others who did it with an ulterior purpose in mind. But inevitably, the women who did so, for whatever reason, were considered traitors and often no better than prostitutes, weren't they?
Oh, it's terrible. Because it's very grey, very morally grey. I mean, for some women, they simply didn't have any choice in it. They really didn't have any choice. They were dealing with a situation where, I mean, the weird thing about Paris was it was denuded of French men. So many had been killed on the front lines as the Germans came into the country. So many of them also were in prisoner of war camps. So you walked around the streets at that period and you were not seeing French men. You were seeing German men. So you had these French women who, being French women, well-dressed, extremely well-presented, up against a whole sudden new arrival, a wave of men who were absolutely electrified at the sight of them. So you can sort of see how these things happened. I mean, nature got in the way. And for many women, they didn't have any income. They'd lost the breadwinner for the family. You know, they had to survive as best they can. Some women simply, you know, they had to swallow down their own morality, their own ethics, and just try and get on. So when you read about what happened in the liberation, it's absolutely dreadful. I mean, so many women were simply scapegoated, really, by the angry French population.
Tell me about Coco Chanel.
Ah, yes. Well, Coco Chanel. So Coco Chanel, of course, is a very, very, very famous designer. An incredible impact on fashion, a lasting impact. Her name is probably the most famous name in fashion. So she was alive during the occupation. She was in probably her 50s, possibly even her 60s. She was always a bit coy about her age. Very, very well preserved. She looked pretty stunning. So she lived at the Hotel Ritz. She was a long-time resident. And her boutique, her flagship store, if you like, was just around the corner in the Rue Cambon. So when the Germans rolled in, she did not leave. She stayed living in the Ritz, where she'd always lived. And she fell in love with a German officer, a very handsome man. And on that level, I am sympathetic. I understand how that could have happened. However, there were a number of things she did which do not paint her now in a very good light at all. One of them was that she benefited from the anti-Jewish laws that were passed by the phony French government that was sort of put in place by the Nazis. They put these laws in so that basically Jewish business owners were relieved of their businesses, shall we say. So Chanel in the 20s had sold off her perfume business, her famous perfume business. She'd sold it off to a couple of Jewish businessmen, and they turned around her business. Her business initially had not been very successful. They made it a phenomenal success, primarily with the Chanel No. 5 brand. Chanel wanted that back. And she used those laws in the 1940s there to ensure that she got it back, and she didn't pay for it. She stole it back from them. And it is very hard to look at that in any other way. It's very hard to look at that sympathetically, I've got to say.
Yeah.
So, and it's certainly something that is overlooked and brushed under the carpet about Chanel. And she was also simultaneously in love with, this man who was probably the love of her life, really. When the liberation came, she used friends in high places, including Winston Churchill, to get her out of it. She didn't pay a price. She just went back to business again, with her perfume back in her own hands again, and she went on to have a wonderful 1950s, 1960s, Yeah. So I've taken a moral stance about Chanel in the book. She's one of the bad guys.
She's not painted in a fabulous light, I have to say.
She really isn't. No, she's a cow. And my four heroines do not have a very high opinion of her at all. In fact, there's an early scene in the book where Chanel is devastatingly rude to them. And I deliberately put that in there so to sort of position the reader, really, just to expect a bit more of that stuff from Chanel. And indeed, she does give it as the story goes on.
Indeed. So tell me about this thread of Parisian fashion that runs through this novel. Why was it important to you to explore haute couture as part of the narrative?
Well, it was such an important part of the Ritz. The French women that stayed at the Ritz that were long-term guests, all of them frequented the haute couture houses. They were beautifully dressed women. So I realised I couldn't really get into their lives without exploring what it was to wear these clothes and understand them. So obviously I don't wear them. But I did find the world of it extremely interesting. I've got a beloved old friend of mine, a man called Richard Nylon, who is a sort of a fashionista here, a long-time fashionista here in Melbourne. He's a milliner these days. He creates stunning hats for the Melbourne Cup every year, but he's also created a lot of fashion over the years, worked for many people. He knows so much about French fashion, so he became my go-to. I went to him first to get just a strong sense of who I should further explore in terms of the designers and the labels and the shops that were around at that time, and he loved sharing that with me. He pointed me towards the importance of some names over others in terms of what they were doing. I mean, and this is the other thing that came up from this too, was that the designers were also being highly subversive and were also doing their own things, acts of resistance against the Nazis too. Chanel closed down, so there's nothing to admire about her in that. She shut the business and threw about 60 women out onto the street who were her loyal seamstresses and other workers. They were all unemployed. She didn't seem to have cared much about that. In fact, indeed, there was a sense that she may have been punishing them for a strike that they took against her. They went on strike about 1936. You got a feeling that it was a bit of like, you've got this coming, as far as Chanel meant. Yeah. But other designers, like Lanvin, for instance, stayed fully operational during the whole period. And some of them came up with clothes that had very sly resistance or liberation messages in them. Including, I think it was Jacques Fat, who created this extraordinary, this sort of like this pantsuit type outfit that a woman could wear when bicycling. And if you looked at it, if you saw it now, you'd realize exactly what it was. It was a three-color flag. It was the French flag. Yeah. But somehow the Germans just didn't quite notice that. And a lot of women were wearing this outfit as a very subtle patriotic message, but not so subtle, really.
And I love that Polly wore it.
She wears it, yes.
That was brilliant. Moving on, I wanted to explore how influential you thought your time as a screenwriter and playwright is on your novel writing.
Yes, it's had a very, very positive effect on my writing. One, in terms of the way I handle structure and craft, everything comes from my screenwriting background, really. Well, I guess I treat it like a screenplay in a sense that I think of it all as a series of scenes. And each scene I approach in a very screenwriterly way. So I love writing dialogue. It's my favourite thing to write. So my books have got a lot of dialogue in them, and I try to make it snappy and funny and sparky dialogue, which is really what I love writing. So my characters are always people that like to talk a lot. but also like to have fun with words. They like to insult each other in creative ways. If they're saying something moving, they will use hopefully quite a poetic way of saying that, to speaking their hearts. I try to make the books as pacey as I can, in a way that a screenplay is pacey. So that you're charging through a story, but also I like to milk moments, as we say, when you get to a moment where of high emotional impact, I try my best to make the most of it, so that you're really feeling it, what the character is feeling, so that you're sitting inside their shoes, sitting inside their clothes, and really understanding them and where they are at this point in time. You mentioned in the introduction the shows that I've worked on, and I spent the longest of my TV gigs was on Neighbours. I was on that show for 7 years, back in the 2000s, and
incredible.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
It was quite a long run.
Yeah.
It was fantastic fun. I really loved working on those shows. I'll use the dirty word for them, soap operas. That's what they are. I'm not ashamed. It's a wonderful thing. But among so many skills that those shows gave me, probably the best one is just my ability to come up with story, and come up with it on the spot, and also I've got I think, a pretty strong understanding of what audiences respond to in terms of the types of stories that really sort of connect. Which is just based really on just working on so much commercial television, and really coming to understand the stuff that really hits home. So I know that's an advantage, and I'm very grateful for it.
So, Luke, what's next? Is there another book on the horizon for you? And if so, can you tell me anything about it?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about it. So it's still sitting in my brain cooking away. I have not put down a single thing on paper yet.
Yep.
However, I'm not leaving World War II. I'm finding there's continued inspiration in this. My next story is going to be set in London, probably in the 1930s leading up to the Blitz period, which, again, the Blitz is one of those periods of history where you just find so much inspiration, because there was just so much courageous behaviour going on, particularly from ordinary people, and most especially from women who were left at home. They weren't out fighting; they were putting up with the war on the home front. So that's what I'm currently exploring. I'm uncovering characters, I'm uncovering scenarios, I'm looking at being able to do a not dissimilar experience to the Heart of the Ritz, which will be. So I'm looking for another, shall we say, behind the palace doors story.
Yeah.
Looking for a rarefied world, a world that's got a glamour wash over the top of it, but will also allow me to do some really, some heartbreaking and some inspirational story, as well as some fun and some wit as well, which is what I like to do, those combinations. So I will find it. So I can't say much more than that. I'm in my reading and exploring stage. But for me, that's a pleasure. I love this stage. It's the easiest stage, and the actual writing is finding the inspiration. So yeah, that's where we are, Claudine.
Can't wait to see what you come up with next, Luke. That's just brilliant. So I wanted to ask you, given your experience in screenwriting, your experience as a teacher, and your success as a novelist, are you able to offer some tips to any aspiring or emerging writers who listen to this podcast?
Probably the best one is simply do it, is write. People do ask me, well, how do I become an author? And there are many ways, there are many paths to take to become one, but all of them have exactly the same first step, and that first step is simply just start writing. It's really, really important to find space and time in your life to do it. If that's what you want to do, then you've got to be really rigorous in carving out that time and space in order to give yourself the chance to do it. And it's that, in so many ways, I find for most people, is the biggest hurdle, is being able to actually be that disciplined and be that in a way that self-centered. And dare I say, hard-hearted as well, in forcing yourself to do that. But it is the step you absolutely have to take. You've got to put yourself first, if that's what you want to do. And it doesn't mean you say you ultimately are neglecting other aspects of your life, but you're just being really, I suppose, protective of this aspect of yourself that, if you know that it needs to flower, shall we say, if you know that you've got stories you want to tell, characters you want to bring to life, a point of view that you want to get across, and you owe it to yourself to do it. And the only way you're going to do it is by getting down there and getting on that computer and just making a start. There's no other way.
Yep. Bums on seats.
Bums on seats. Most people who are doing it have been slogging away at it for quite a long time. They've really applied themselves to this. And so that's another part of it, is just getting on with it. There are knockbacks. Yes, there are. It's funny because I hear a lot of stories about, people writing what they did for to get published for the first time, and they're usually quite different. They can vary a lot. And I always think, God, I actually had a relatively easy path there. I actually did, in terms of getting published. But the reason for that was because because TV was sort of there already for me, and before that, theatre. So I sort of go back and think, gosh, well, I might have had it easy getting my books out there, or relatively easy, but it was really hard to get into TV. And so I guess I always think, well, that's where I really had to put the slog in.
Yeah.
That was hard. Yeah, I didn't have any contacts, and I just had to go out there and carve a path for myself, really. So it really applies. It applies to whatever aspect of writing you might be thinking you might want to do. It's just a matter of beating the drum, trying to make your networks as best you can. In the world of novel writing, it is so greatly aided these days by social media. It's for all its ills, there are so many positives for social media too. And it is really easy to make connections with people who are in the publishing industry, or we're talking about authors, publishers themselves, editors, people who do publicity. They're all out there to be found, be it on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. I use Instagram myself. I love Instagram so much, just because it's given me such a wonderful, warm and supportive writing community that I dip into every day. Yeah. There are very few Australian authors that I'm not following, and there's very few that I haven't engaged with, yeah. And it's entirely online. I mean, I live in Castlemaine, which is in central Victoria, and so I guess I'm classified as a regional writer, even though I go to Melbourne most days to work. But it is isolating. I mean, writing is isolating, full stop. And I don't really get to go to a lot of events necessarily that happen in Melbourne, just because at the end of the day, I just want to get on the train and go home. know. So I have found for me that social media has just really sort of replaced that, that sort of stuff. I've been able to just have a high profile there, and I've met a lot of people and formed a lot of connections, including yourself, Claudine. I know you from Instagram.
That's right.
And yeah, I love your Instagram presence. So it's inspiring. So yeah, I think this is for anybody. This is a really easy first step. Really, is just get that app and go and explore, and you can follow people and you can engage. People send me messages all the time on Instagram, and I love it. Yeah. I'm really happy to be engaged with.
Yeah.
Probably a little less so Goodreads. Goodreads is a bit harsh.
The general sense amongst Australian writers is that we exist in a very, very supportive community. Now, whether you're an unpublished writer or a published writer, I think the sense that there's people lifting you up is very strong here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And the other thing that you touched on was the Goodreads thing. And it's funny because I was talking to a couple of people about it specifically on Sunday and asking people, do they read the reviews on Goodreads? And a lot of people were very ambivalent about the advisability of doing so, shall I say. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, you obviously want, people to engage with you, and you want people to learn about your book and your writing. And I think you'll find that most people who love your book won't actually take the time to write a good review. But the people that don't like your book...
It's like anything, isn't it? It's like if you stay in a hotel. And if you had a really great time, you're probably not going to bother reviewing it. But if you had a really rotten time, you're going straight onto TripAdvisor.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I guess there is certainly a word of truth to that. Most people who read books probably don't bother to go onto Goodreads or go onto Amazon or wherever. There's so many places you can review books.
Yeah.
But there are some truly passionate bibliophiles that do make the trouble to say nice things about the books they've read. So I'm when they've said nice things about me, I'm very, very grateful to that. Yeah. That's a wonderful experience. I mean, who doesn't want to read something nice said about your work?
Course.
I mean, Yeah, it's very validating, and I'm not going to claim that I don't find that validating. I love to know that my work is connected with someone else. It's just there's nothing better than that. There really isn't. But then again, you get someone that just didn't get it, that just didn't go the journey and didn't finish it, or whatever. They just didn't get there. And of course that happens, and there's nothing you can do about that. It's just how it is.
Yeah.
But I do wish they wouldn't say so publicly, because it's there forever. I've actually been writing for 30 years. I know that sounds a bit gobsmacking, but I was only a slip of a lad when I started. But I've been reviewed for 30 years, and I started out writing plays. That was my foray into being reviewed publicly, was as a playwright. And yes, I had some shocking reviews in the early days, and I also had some wonderful reviews as well. But what was so, at least, as awful as it was to get a rotten review in the old days, at least it would only last a day. It would only be in a single issue of the newspaper, and that'd be it. It'd be gone. Nowadays, it's there forever, and people in decades and decades to come can go back and look at your rotten review. Oh,
well, I guess there's a message in there for all these listeners and readers out there. Take the time. If you've got something really nice to say and you thoroughly enjoyed a book, get onto Goodreads or Amazon or wherever, post something nice.
Yeah, say something nice.
Exactly. And for authors, hope that, the good reviews outweigh the bad ones.
Yeah. Oh, look, I think they do in the end. I think you do end up with more good ones than bad ones. Absolutely. And I've certainly got more good ones than bad ones. But I look at social media, and this is what we shouldn't shy away from it. I mean, I know there are other authors out there that say, don't comment on reviews on Goodreads. But I think, well, why the hell not? It's a two-way street. This is what social media is. We should just treat it all as the one thing. We shouldn't pretend our feelings haven't been hurt. We shouldn't pretend we do not have an emotional reaction to that stuff. We should just get back there and put out a comment.
Yeah.
So look, to be honest, I do. I will say it. And I am but human. I am but human.
People are obviously entitled to their opinions, but I think we should all be respectful.
Absolutely.
So, Luke, if listeners wanted to find out a little bit more about you or to connect with you, how could they do that?
Well, Instagram's great. They're welcome to follow me. They can send me messages on Instagram. I'm all for it. That's my chosen and my favourite social media platform. Mm-hmm. I also have my website, lukedevenish.com. Which is easy to find, and you can contact me through that as well. That's very easy, and I always respond. I love getting messages. So they're probably the two best ways.
Awesome. Luke, congratulations on a marvellous, thoroughly entertaining book. I wanted to thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today, and I wish you every success with it.
Oh, thank you, Claudine. You are a saint for your services to Aussie literature.
Thank you. That's very kind. Now, listeners, don't forget, a free copy of this book could be yours. All you have to do is head over to my Facebook or Instagram account and follow the prompts to win. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.